Hey scholars, welcome to our first real in-depth look at the Barron's book. Well, we're going to start with Unit 2 because it's kind of where we started at as far as our class pace went. Unit 2 is the living world. It's made up to 10 to 15% of the multiple choice questions on the exam. And it has some specific areas, A through E here. It says ecosystem structure, which is biological populations and communities, niches, interactions among species, keystone species, all sorts of stuff. B is energy flow, so how the energy transfers from trophic level to trophic level to the ecosystem. Ecosystem diversity, so what kind of ecosystems do we have? Natural selection, evolution. Letter D, natural ecosystem change, so like climate shifts, species movements, ecological succession. And finally, natural biogeochemical cycles, which would be our next lesson on Chapter 5 of this book. Looking at the different carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and water cycles. So we're going to start with ecosystems today. It's basically the study of ecology, whereas you're looking at living and non-living things interacting together, and that's really what ecology is all about. The book itself talks a little bit more about, especially the 5th edition compared to this edition, talks about these 3 different types of, populations and how they are organized. But we're going to first take a look at this paragraph first, which basically talks about different organisms of the same species interacting with each other. If that is the case, it's called intraspecific. If it is populations of different species interacting, then it's going to be interspecific, kind of inter between 2 species. A community is made up of all the populations of different species that live together within a given area. And an ecosystem is kind of formed from many communities living in a given area with their physical environments. And then finally, organisms make up populations, kind of going into smaller scale, which help make up communities, etc. So here's kind of the hierarchy of it all. We start at the biosphere, which is pretty much all the living things in a given area. Then we go a little more specific to ecosystems. And then we go to communities, smaller than ecosystems, communities, smaller than communities as populations, and then smaller than populations as species, and then obviously within a species you have actual organisms. So the members of the population can actually be distributed in 3 different ways, and we're going to kind of talk about each of those today. The first one is clumped, and this is where some areas within a habitat are dense with organisms, while others contain very few members. Now, most of the reason this is for is because they're trying to come together for a number of different reasons. It can be to help them survive when these are when scarce resources are about. For instance, one of the reasons why elephants clump is to near watering holes during the dry season. There's only obviously certain areas that have water, which is a valuable resource for those members of the population. As well as if they feel threatened, they will clump together and protect the smaller individuals of the herd. Another example that they give here is organisms that serve as prey usually clump together for a number of different reasons, like zebras stay in big herds, kind of disrupt and kind of distract with their weird visual patterns of stripes the predator from actually them being eaten, so a little bit safety in numbers. So there's a couple of different reasons why organisms clump. Sometimes it's to protect young, like I said, juveniles coming up, they couldn't just go on their own way. So those are a couple of different reasons there. Another one is random. And this is where little interactions between members of the population leading to random spacing patterns. So usually occurs in habitats where environmental conditions and resources are very consistent. This pattern of dispersion is characterized by a lack of any strong social interactants, like, for instance, dandelion seeds being dispersed by wind. Well, wherever the wind takes it, it's going to go. So that's kind of that random dispersion method. Same thing with the maple trees and little helicopter things. As far as the wind blows them, it's wherever they land. The last one is uniform, and this is where there's a very uniform spacing between individuals. Uniform distributions are found in populations in which the distance between neighboring individuals is fully maximized. The need to maximize the space between individuals arises from competition from resources, moisture, nutrients, sunlight, food, all that kind of stuff. So some of this might be, as for instance, penguins often exhibit uniform spacing and aggressive defending of their territory, especially during mating season when they're laying eggs. So if you look at their eggs, they're all very uniformly dispersed. Some species of trees do this because they need certain distances from other in order to spread their roots out and get as much resources as possible as well. So those are 2 examples of uniform species and also population characteristics. Ecosystem characteristics. So that's some population characteristics. Some ecosystem or community characteristics are the physical appearance, the relative size, and stratification, like layers, as far as populations and species go. There's also species diversity, the number of different species in a given area. It's also called diversity of species or biodiversity. Species abundance is the number of individuals in a species, or species richness, I like to call that word. And then also niche structure is the number of ecological niches and how they resemble from different, how they interact and how they are different from each other as well. So those are our 4 different types of community characteristics as well. And there's just some images of being clumped and being randomized and being very uniform in pattern as far as populations go. So let's take a closer look at ecological niches today. And obviously there's a couple of different types here. We have more generalist species that have broad niches. These are usually your R-selected species. They're able to withstand a lot of wide range of environmental conditions, like cockroaches, mice, and even sometimes humans can be an example of this. Whereas specialist species live in very narrow niches. They're sensitive to environmental changes. When you list these guys as K-selected species, they really can't tolerate change that much. And when conditions are stable, specialists have all the advantage in the world because there are a few competitors as each species occupies its own little unique niche. But as far as that goes, those are kind of organisms that are within ecological niches. Interactions among species. There are various types of interactions. We're going to kind of take a look at all of these with these different symbols. Some of them are a little bit faded, and I'll explain what they mean. The first one that most of you probably heard of in biology, but the first one is amensalism. That's supposed to be a frown face and then just a straight face. So amensalism is actually the interaction between two species where one suffers and the other really is unaffected. And this occurs when an organism, this is an example, releases a chemical compound that is detrimental to another organism. So example of a bread mold, penicillium, which is also produced penicillin, helps fight infections, which is the chemical that kills bacteria. The black walnut tree releases chemicals that kill its neighboring plants around it. So the black walnut tree doesn't really affect it, like positively really. It just doesn't really know it's doing it. And then it also clears, I guess, I think of amensalism as kind of a weird situation because really the plant is benefiting, just not directly, because if there's no organisms around it because it secreted I guess some sort of chemical that kills neighboring plants, then it also allows them to gain more access to nutrients. But in this case, they call this amensalism. Another one that you're probably familiar with is commensalism. This is an interaction where one species benefits, which is happy face, the other one is unaffected. And this couple of different types is the remora on a shark or mites on a dung beetle. This is called foracy, which is this is a type of form that basically just allows using another organism for transport. So like the remora sticks to the shark, it doesn't really get anything. If it's just sticking to the shark, using it to move about, that would be a type of foracy, which is just using the organism for transport. Inquilinism, which is using the organism for housing, such as an epiphytic plant, which is like plants that Spanish moss, I guess, would kind of be an example of this. It doesn't really kill the tree for the most part, but it does kind of sit and kind of attaches to the tree to get better access to nutrients and resources. Or what else have we got? Orchids, or trees or birds living in the holes of trees or making their nests in trees. Those are another example as well. Even metabiosis is an example where using something that another organism actually created, like a hermit crab in a shell of a marine snail for protection. So all three of those, foracy, inquilinism, and then also metabiosis, they're all forms of commensalism. There's some examples of each. Competition you're probably familiar with. We already kind of talked about that before. It can be either intraspecific competition between members of the same species, like two deer battling it out for mating rights to a female, or it can be interspecific competition, a bear and a wolf fighting over access to the ability to kill and eat the deer. So those are two different types of examples there. It says example types of competition include interference, where an organism, individuals by interfering with foraging, survival, reproduction by preventing the species to establish itself within a habitat, or exploitation, which occurs indirectly through some sort of common limiting resource that acts as some sort of intermediate between the two. And then the apparent competition, which occurs indirectly between two species where they're both sought after by the same predator. So those are a couple different types of competition as well. Mutualism, another example that most of you are familiar with, where both species benefit two happy faces, where two things are getting something from each other. One of them, it can be obligatory mutualism, where they have to have each other to survive, like a microhazy fungi being totally dependent on their plant host. Or it can be non-obligatory or facultative is another word, where we actually see they don't really need to live with each other, but they could, and that would be a good thing. So like a rhizobia bacteria reproducing either in soil or a symbiotic relationship with legumes. Those are some more microbiology examples. Other examples of mutualism, which would probably be, for the most part, I would say obligatory, would be the clownfish and the sea anemone. They've been kind of with each other for a long time, and I've never seen any clownfish not live in and around a sea anemone. Parasitism, another example that you're most familiar with probably from biology, is interaction where one species benefits with the happy face, the other one is negatively affected. So one benefits at the expense of another. And so this is a parasite lives on a host known as an ectoparasite, like a mosquito, is often elaborate mechanisms and strategies for acquiring its host, like leeches locate their host by sensing movement and confirming their identity through the touching and chemical cues on the skin. The parasite lives within the host, known as endoparasite, hence the inner part. Tapeworms are examples of these. And it acquires its host by passive mechanisms such as the ingestions of eggs in the meat or uncooked meat. Biotrophic parasites must keep their hosts alive and represent a successful mode of life. Many viruses are examples of biotrophic parasites. And then there's also necrotrophs, which are parasites that eventually kill their hosts. Or social parasites involve behaviors that benefit the parasitism and harm of the hosts, like cuckoo birds that use other birds to raise their young, or nectar-robbing behaviors of insects and birds. So hosts have evolved defense mechanisms with immune systems and plant toxins to diminish this parasitism, and it's kind of been an ongoing evolutionary battle between the two. All right, predation. This is supposed to be a happy face and a very negative face, even though it's blotched out there. But predators hunt and kill prey through the act of predation, where one's getting a meal, and the other one is dying. So that's definitely a positive and negative interaction. And then finally, our last interaction is saprotrophism, where one organism benefits, another one is relatively unaffected. So most of the reason why they're unaffected is because they're already dead. So saprotrophs obtain their nutrients from dead or decaying plants and animals through absorptions of soluble organic compounds, fungi, bacteria, and protozoans. And also vultures and dung beetles could be considered saprotrophs because they are getting their food from an already dead organism. So those are our main different types of interactions among species. Let's go back and review those. We've got amensalism, commensalism, competition, mutualism, parasitism, predation, and saprotrophism. One species that I want to highlight today are keystone species. And a keystone species is one whose very presence contributes to the diversity of life and whose extinction or removal from the ecosystem would lead to the extinction or removal of other life forms. So they're keystone, and the reason why we call this a keystone is because in building, the keystone in an archway is literally the top stone of the archway. If it's removed, the whole archway collapses. So it's a very, very vital organism to the ecosystem, just as the keystone rock itself is vital to the archway. So a classic keystone species is a small predator that prevents a particular herbivorous species from decimating a dominant plant species. Other examples are a couple of those listed below here. There is a removal of the grizzly bear and the prairie dogs in the 5th edition, so they only focus on sea stars and sea otters. So if I were to study those, I'd study these two the most. Sea stars are prey on sea urchins, mussels, and other shellfish that have no natural predators. If sea stars were removed from the ecosystem, those mussel populations would explode, driving out other species. So sea urchin populations rise to the point where they begin to decimate coral reefs, and then you lose another habitat. So those sea stars are very vital. Also, sea otters in kelp forests, they also prey upon sea urchins, and kelp roots serve as anchors and not as nutrient-absorbing systems as found in land plants. And if left unchecked, those sea urchins destroy the kelp forest, and there goes another ecosystem that's very valuable to us. The grizzly bear it serves as ecosystem engineers by transferring nutrients from the ocean forest systems and to the forest systems. And they do this by capturing salmon from rivers and streams, and bringing them up onto land where they eat them, where all their, they defecate, and also all those nutrients go into the ground to the forest ecosystem. Prairie dogs colonize and use ecological sanctuary for other organisms. Where prairie dogs occur, there are a greater number of arthropods and small mammal populations, and also an increase in bird diversity and density, and a greater population of predators as well. So they kind of serve as kind of like the holding ground for everything in that ecosystem. Let's take a look at species diversity. This is organisms that live in different environments, are specifically adapted to their particular biome. And so there are different organisms that have obviously adapted well to those specific ecosystems. For instance, aquatic ecosystems. Water provides buoyancy, reduces the need for supportive structure of legs and trunks. And so all these different characteristics of water itself, reducing energy spent on searching for food. These include feeder fish, barnacles, clams, oysters, that have all adapted to living well in aquatic habitats. Same thing as desert organisms. They've adapted. They're spaced out to limiting factors. Cactus, short-lived annual wildflowers, because there's just certain times that they can grow. They have sharp, prickly spines that protect all their nutrients inside. They have very, very thick cuticles, which are basically a waxy coating to prevent from water loss in those hot, dry climates. Kangaroo rats produce their own water and secrete concentrated urine because of the lack of water, so they reduce water release from their bodies. And insects and reptiles have outer thick coverings to minimize water loss, just as the cacti does with its cuticle. So those are a couple of organisms that have adapted there. Grassland organisms. Grasses go out from the bottom of the basal meristem, so they can grow and gain they can keep growing again after being nibbled by grazing animals. And then also grazers and browsing animals that eat vegetation at different heights. It's not to compete with each other, like giraffes eat near the tops of trees, elephants at lower down, and zebras obviously even lower than that at the tall grasses, and gazelles even eat the shorter grass. So they have adapted as far as serving their different niche and their food source within those grassland ecosystems. Forest ecosystems, some live in the different layers or stratifications of the canopy. So all the way at the top of the canopy, some kind of live as epiphytes on the trunks of those trees. Some were in the middle, and even somewhere live on the roots of trees, are shallow and can live down. Flowers can live down even at the bottom, even with very limited amount of sunlight. Temperate deciduous forests have adapted to obviously losing leaves and then gaining them back in the spring and the summer seasons. And evergreen coniferous forests have small waxy coated needles able to withstand cold and the droughts of winter. So obviously some adaptations there. Temperate scrub forest land organisms have small waxy coated leaves to reduce transpiration again. And many plants produce toxins to leach in the soil to prevent competition with one which is called allelopathy. Vegetation becomes dormant during the dry seasons, so that way it doesn't really outuse its resources. And rodents are common and store seeds underground in burrows, and also fire reduces the competition and also stimulates germination from seeds. Tundra organisms, polar grassland plants are adapted to low sunlight, low amounts of free water, high winds, and very, very cold temperatures. And tundra plants primarily grow during the summer months instead of when it's freezing cold. Many plants survive the winter as roots, stems, bulbs, or tubers, and lichens dehydrate during winter to avoid frost damage, and then obviously flourish again in the spring. So those are a couple of different organisms and adaptations of organisms that have able to allow them to live in those different ecosystems. One other term that we're going to look at is the edge effects, and the edge effect refers to how local environment changes along some types of boundary or edge. So for instance, specifically with clear-cutting forests, or if you were to build a road in an area, like for instance, they're widening the road nearby our nearby school. There obviously were forests there. As they widen those roads, they're taking out the edges, the already adapted edges of those forests. When they do that, they're exposing other trees that haven't really been exposed to bright sunlight, open areas on the edge, and therefore can cause some of those trees to die and actually push back that boundary even further. And so that's kind of an example of the edge effect, where either by deforestation, clear cutting, or road building, which also involves clear cutting, you obviously are exposing organisms, most of the time forests or trees or plants, to more sunlight or more water or more air pollution, all those kind of things that they're not used to, and that could drive back the edge or your boundary even further. Okay. Major terrestrial and aquatic biomes. Again, we can go through all these. Again, we'll go through all the different biomes. The Antarctic, which has, and you're kind of responsible for knowing all the different characteristics of these areas. But Antarctic is the area surrounding the South Pole. Rainfall is less than 2 inches or less than 5 centimeters per year if we're using the metric system. The benthos is the bottom of the ocean, also called the Hadal. No sunlight, therefore no plant life. Primary energy resource comes from dead organisms floating all the way to the bottom, or chemosynthesis. Coastal zones, also in oceans, including estuaries, wetlands, and coral reefs. High diversity accounts of species and plants due to runoff from land. Coral reefs, warm, clear, shallow ocean habitats near land, generally in the tropics. And there are 3 types of coral reefs. There's fringing reefs that grow on continental shelves near the coastline, barrier reefs that are parallel to the shoreline but farther from shore, and coral atolls, which are rings of coral that grow upon sunken oceanic volcanoes. And coral reefs are disappearing at an alarming rate due to temperature rising, pollution, dredging, and sedimentation along the coast. Deserts occur between 15 and 25 degrees north and south latitude, generally occur in interiors of continents. They occupy 20% of all landmass. The rainfall is less than 20 inches per year. Air currents are descending, which are generally diminishing the formation of rain, and therefore brings that arid climate. And soils often have abundant nutrients but lack organic matter and consist of sand, closely packed boulders, little humus in the soil profile to really give good growth. Freshwater wetlands include freshwater swamps, marshes, bogs, prairie potholes, ponds, peat bogs, riparian areas. All those are examples of freshwater wetlands. And the ground is usually saturated with fresh, freestanding water a majority of the year. It can be seasonal, but most of the time it does have some water. Soil is low in oxygen, important breeding areas of insects, amphibians, and reptiles. Prime areas of human development, which has kind of been the cause and the demise of the freshwater wetlands. Easily polluted, but they can handle some pollution. But again, if overexposed to pollution, can be very, very bad for the environment, at least for this freshwater wetlands. A lake, so looking at freshwater areas, water inputs include runoff, groundwater, and streams. A lake is a body of water of considerable size surrounded by land. The vast majority of lakes on Earth are freshwater, and most in the northern hemisphere at higher altitudes. Lakes can be classified on a basis of richness and nutrients, and then also effects of plant growth and animal diversity. There are 2 types of lakes: oligotrophic, which contain very low amounts of nutrients, which includes small amounts of plant life and other forms of biomass. And there are eutrophic lakes that are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, that have lots of diversity of phytoplankton and zooplankton, and support a variety of a large diversity of fish. During warmer weather, the oxygen content of the water may decrease, and resulting in die-offs of organisms. And then we even have hyper-eutrophic, which is caused by humans of over-fertilizing, and that fertilizer running off into these low-lying areas of lakes. Grasslands, found in areas too dry for forests and too wet for deserts, and rainfall is seasonal. Temperatures are moderate. Grasslands occupy approximately 25% of all the land area, and few trees and shrubs due to frequent seasonal fires and water availability, and also soils are rich in organic matter. The upper horizon of the soil, the A and the O horizon, are alkaline, dark, and rich in humus, extensively used by humans for agriculture, which has also led to the demise of natural grasslands. Hydrothermal vents are deep oceanic vents, or where hot water vents are rich in sulfur compounds and are found that provide energy for chemosynthetic bacteria. We have intertidal, which are basically the shoreline exposed to water during the high tide, and then the air during low tide, so obviously causing a shift in that ecosystem, which organisms have to adapt to, and they are sensitive to pollution from land runoff and ocean pollution. The ocean itself occupies 75% of the Earth's surface, areas of low diversity and low productivity except near the shoreline, and it's usually low in nitrogen and phosphorus, which limits plant growth, and smaller organisms end up feeding on those. Larger animals occur, but very, very low densities. So, savannas, which are a type of grassland, warm year-round, scattered trees. The environment is intermediate between grasslands and forests. It has extended dry seasons, followed by rainy seasons. And it says that trees and shrubs generally shed leaves during the dry season, which reduces need for water, so conserving water for the plant. Food is limited during the dry season, requiring many animals to migrate and move to areas that have some water. Soils are rich in nutrients, contain large herds of grazing animals, again, and browsing animals that provide resources as for predators like lions, cheetahs, hyenas, etc. Taiga, or the coniferous or boreal forest, generally found between 45 and 60 degrees north latitude. It occupies 17% of the land surface. Forests of cold climates and high altitudes usually. Two types of taigas are the open woodland and dense forest. And then obviously more precipitation than the tundra. Generally, precipitation occurs during the summer months due to mid-latitude cyclones, and soils generally poor in nutrients because of large amounts of leaching out caused by rainfall. And then you have deep layers of litter, and decomposition is slow because of low temperatures. Dense stands of small trees can cause understory to be very, very lowly lit, and then low biodiversity because of the harshness in the environment. Temperate deciduous forest is where we live in North Carolina. Forests found in milder temperatures than boreal forests of the taiga. Rapid decomposition due to mild temperatures and precipitation, which results in small amounts of litter on the surface. Because of the mild climate, this biome is generally greatly exploited by humans for agriculture, lumber, and urban development. Soil is generally poor in nutrients. Tall deciduous trees means they lose their leaves. Rich and diverse understory, and low density of large animals due to shade that prevents much ground vegetation. And this is where we live. We've dominated the temperate deciduous forest because it does have a relatively mild temperature and precipitation year-round. The temperate rainforest is a moderate temperature and rainfall exceeding 100 inches, 250 centimeters per year. Low biodiversity has a limited light, which limits food for herbivores and major resources of timber. And this would be out towards the northwest area of the temperate rainforest, like in Seattle and Washington out there. Temperate shrubland, or the chaparral. Hot and dry summers with mild, cool, and rainy winters. In the summer months and spring, subtropic high-pressure zones exist over the area, and rainfalls during the winter, again, due to mid-latitude cyclones, average rain is only 15 to 40 inches per year. And it's also characterized by dense shrub growth, and decomposition is very slow during the summer months. Few large mammals. Erosion is common, especially after fires, and then the rains following. And so those are a few characteristics of the chaparral. Temperate woodlands. Drier climates than the deciduous forest, dominated by small trees. Stands of trees are very open, allowing light to reach the ground. Fires are also common in the temperate woodlands. Tropical rainforest. High and consistent temperatures of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. Rainfall ranges between 75 and 100 inches or 200 to 250 centimeters per year, and found within the Hadley cells near the equator. High species diversity for both plants and animals, up to 100 different tree species per square kilometer, as opposed to 3 to 5 in a temperate zone. Vegetation is very dense. Soil are low in nutrients because most of the nutrients are stored in the vegetation that have pulled them out of the ground. Soil is very acidic, and the decomposition of organic material is very fast due to temperature and moisture. Leaching of those nutrients is very high, and the very abundant insect and animal biodiversity in these regions. Humans end up usually clearing this area, tropical rainforest, for agriculture and cattle raising through a technique called slash and burn. And when they burn it, obviously those nutrients return to the soil. Due to poor soil nutrient levels, agriculture activity lasts for only a limited time and can be extended only by applying expensive fertilizers, which cause you to destroy the forest even more, becoming a positive feedback loop. Tropical seasonal forest occurs in areas of seasonal rainfall or the monsoon areas that are followed by long dry seasons, warm temperatures year-round, and contain a mix of deciduous and evergreen trees. The tundra is our final ecosystem today, and the tundra is at the 60-degree north latitude and above towards the poles or below, and also, well, I guess just above in this case because that's Antarctica before. Influenced by polar cells, which are the furthest from the equator. Alpine tundra is located in mountainous areas above the tree line with well-drained soil dominated by animals, including small rodents and insects. Arctic tundra is frozen, treeless plains, low rainfall, very low average temperature, and the growing season only lasts about 2 months if the permafrost even freezes. Thaws out. Soil has few nutrients because of low vegetation and little decomposition, and permafrost is permanently frozen ground and a barrier for roots that they cannot drive even further. So those are all of our examples of major biomes of the world. There's a little map that kind of shows you all of where those are located here. I definitely check that out. And if they ever asked you, like, point to this one, what kind of biome is that? Definitely need to know that off the top of your head. Energy flow. Let's look at energy flow. The ultimate source, the perpetual source of energy is the sun. And again, through plants and photosynthesis, we have allowed us to make huge strides in gaining access to that energy. So we're going to take a closer look at energy flow a little bit. This is the equation for photosynthesis. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 water molecules plus sunlight yields C6H12O6, which is the common chemical formula for glucose, plus 6 oxygen molecules. So that is the simple formula, and I think this is the word formula from it, but oxygen gas is released in the atmosphere during photosynthesis, and plants also emit carbon dioxide during respiration. So you need to remember that both plants and animals do respiration, and only plants do photosynthesis. They also produce less carbon than they absorb, and therefore become net sinks of carbon, which is a good thing as far as the whole carbon cycle, which we'll get to next in Chapter 5. Organisms that undergo photosynthesis are called photoautotrophs. Factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis amount light, of wavelength of light, carbon dioxide, and also availability of water and possibly temperature. So there's many pathways of photosynthesis that can actually happen. I'm not going to go into all these. This actually looks very complicated to me, but they put it in there as a way of helping you remember all these things. But organisms depend on photosynthetic organisms. These are called heterotrophs. And in general, cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. Actually, is the flip the equation there. The energy is stored as the molecule of ATP energy, and it's not sunlight, but we use the glucose molecule plus oxygen molecule to produce a large amount of ATP energy, and also as a byproduct produce CO2 and water. Food webs and trophic levels. There are primary producers, again, which we just talked about, are the plants. They convert the solar energy into chemical energy through photosynthesis and into glucose molecules. Primary consumers are heterotrophs, or the herbivores that just eat the plants, like as in the rabbit here. And they get their energy by consuming just primary producers, which are their plants. Primary consumers have developed defense mechanisms against predation, like speed, like the rabbit, flight, possibly if they're birds, quills, if it's a porcupine, tough hides, camouflage, horns and antlers. All those things help them to defend against those secondary consumers. And those secondary consumers, again, are heterotrophs, but they may either be strictly carnivores, meat eaters, or they are omnivores. They eat both plants and animals. And these next few photos, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they give you different examples of food webs based on the ecosystem. For instance, the desert, the ocean food web, and you can pause this and take a look at those if you wish. The coniferous forest food web, the deciduous forest food web, the tropical rainforest food web, and the temperate rainforest food web as well. So there's a few different examples of food webs and showing those interrelationships between who eats who and where that energy flows per trophic level. Now, one thing, before we get into any more of this, I do want to stop and say the ecological pyramids, but they left out, well, they know about the 10% rule. Everyone knows about that. Only 10% of the energy is transferred on to the next trophic level, because 90% of it is used in bodily functions, mostly through respiration and metabolism, breaking down those molecules inside of what you eat. So that is kind of the 10% rule. 90 is lost in available energy as one moves to the next higher trophic level, and 10% energy is actually passed on. That's the 10% rule, if you hear about that on the exam. Detritus energy pyramids of organisms are significantly different in structure. The size of the organisms are smaller, and organisms exist in environments rich in nutrients, so energy is not needed to obtain food. So if we're looking at just literally like a pyramid of smaller organisms or decomposers, it looks a little bit different. Notable exception, the scheme of the pyramid of biomass occurs in aquatic ecosystem. In this ecosystem, the producers are mainly microscopic algae. Although the number of algae is great, their biomass is quite small. So actually, theirs looks very kind of like almost an upside down pyramid, because they're much smaller as far as mass goes, or biomass. Okay, but most of them look just like this as far as desert biomass pyramid, the marine biomass pyramid, etc. And then there's the deciduous forest biomass pyramid. Again, you can zoom in on this and take a closer look at the temperate rainforest biomass pyramid and the tundra biomass. But all those land-dwelling ones are mostly correct pyramids, as far as aquatic ecosystems and open ocean marine environments usually are kind of an inverted pyramid because of biomass. Again, biomass is the total amount of measurable weight that an organism is made up without water, so not counting water, the living tissue. So ecosystem diversity, let's take a look closer look at this, but before we do that, there's this that leaves it out in the Barron's book in the 3rd edition, but in the 5th edition, it talks about GPP and NPP, gross primary productivity versus net primary productivity. And we usually do a whole thing on this in my class about making cartoon character food webs and really issuing them certain percentages based on the environments that they're in. And so they give you a simple equation here. I'm going to go over it with you. I'll post it above where I'm at right now. But NPP equals GPP minus plant respiration. So gross primary productivity is all the energy that the plant does, but because it has to do respiration to grow itself, you subtract that, and then you get your net primary productivity, which is what can be passed on to the next trophic level from producers to first order or first level consumers. Okay, so that's kind of important to know. And don't forget about, remember, depending on the ecosystem and depending on that net primary productivity depends on how much energy is passed on the trophic level. For instance, estuaries have a much higher net primary productivity, so they might be passing more than that 10% rule on per trophic level, whereas extreme deserts, very, very small amount, probably don't even pass on 10%. So it varies depending on the net primary productivity. Don't forget about that. We did a whole lab on that with our cartoon character food webs. Let's go ahead and get into ecosystem diversity, taking a closer look at biodiversity, and attempting to describe diversity at 3 levels: the genetic, the species, and the ecosystem. And we're going to take a closer look at each of these. But one of the biodiversities, again, genetic diversity involves the range of all the genetic traits, both the expressed and the unexpressed, or the recessive, that makes up a gene pool of a species. The species diversity, the number of different species in a habitat, a specific area, and also, like, for instance, tropical rainforests have a higher species diversity than extreme deserts because there's only a few species that have adapted to living in those harsh environments. And the ecosystem diversity concerns the range of habitats that can be found in maybe a much larger area. So biodiversity, again, biodiversity increasers, lots of different habitats, disturbance in the habitat itself, fires, storms, and so on, environmental conditions with low variation, trophic levels with high diversity, middle states of succession, evolution. Diversity decrease, things that decrease diversity, extreme environments, environmental stressors, extreme limitations in the supply of a resource, extreme amounts of disturbance, and an introduction of species from other areas, and geographic isolation. Those things, they narrow biodiversity overall. So, most scientists believe the number of species on Earth between 10 and 30 million overall, and tropical rainforests cover approximately 7% of the total dry surface of the Earth, however, hold half the species on Earth, which is kind of crazy. But scientists have given names to only 1.5 million species, but think there's 30 million species out there, so there's a lot more to identify. Let's take a look at a little bit of evolution here with natural selection. And natural selection is the mechanism of how organisms evolve. Natural selection works on an individual level by determining which organisms have adaptations that allow them to actually survive, reproduce, and be able to pass on those traits to their offspring. So there's several different types of natural selection, or different types of selection methods. And one of those is stabilizing selection. And stabilizing selection affects the extremes of a population. And the most common form of natural selection is stabilizing selection. The individuals that deviate too far from that average condition are then removed, and the results are decrease in diversity, maintenance of stable gene pools, and no evolution. For example, human babies that are too low in weight or too high in weight usually have survival problems early on. Other examples of stabilizing selection are just when does it occur is usually already well adapted conditions by eliminating any organisms that deviate from the norm. And again, this would be if the ecosystem remains unchanged. The fittest organism will also remain unchanged and therefore provide this stabilizing selection. So as long as there's not a whole lot of change going on, stabilizing selection can occur. Another example, kind of the opposite of it, is directional selection, where directional selection affects the extremes of a population. Individuals toward one end of the distribution may do extremely well, as on the other end they're going to go much further down. An example of this is melanism of the peppered moth, which is an example you learn about in biology. and then the evolution of the horse. The early horse, I hate horses, present during the early Eocene was a small-bodied creature that moved well through heavy brush and woodlands. Today's horse have very long legs, designed for speed in the open grasslands and changes in its dental and toe structure compared to its ancestors. Now, going back to the peppered moth, which is a better example because no one likes to talk about horses, is peppered moths the whole story behind that was pre-industrial revolution. They were usually white in color with a few dots of black that blended in perfectly with birch trees or paper birch trees, which are white as far as their bark goes. After the Industrial Revolution, the smoke and the soot condensed on the trees, caused them to turn a darker color. Therefore, the white moths were more easily viewable because of their lack of camouflage, and the birds picked those off. And the ones that had that genetic mutation to have more darker black spots eventually lived on, and therefore your species kind of changed or evolved itself to becoming more dark in nature. And so that's an example of where the one end of the species benefits, the other end is really going down, which is showed you by here. Disruptive selection is our last one, and this selection acts against individuals that have average conditions. The population is essentially split into two. Both direction disruptive selections affects the gene pool. In both cases, populations change and evolution occurs. And one example, going back to directional selection, another example of this is pesticide or antibiotic resistance. Where you have you're treating with antibiotics. If you overuse antibiotics, there's always a few of those species that can survive, and then they make a stronger and stronger breed of bacteria, which ends up becoming MERS. So that's another example of directional selection. I apologize for leaving that out. And then disruptive selection, a different example, is that African butterflies can range in color from orange to blue. And so the orange and blue forms mimic foul-tasting species, so predators avoid those, while the colors in between don't ward off those predators, so butterflies with those colors are eaten more often. And so as a result, the butterflies with intermediate colors are eliminated from the population, while butterflies with extreme colors survive. So that is another example of disruptive selection. Okay? Natural selection, again, process of natural selection is competition. Disproportionate increase in persistence and a phenotypic adaptation in successful populations. For a description of this, it's variations that are advantageous to the individual in terms of survival, allow more organisms possessing the traits to survive, reproduce, and pass on those characteristics. Geometric or exponential increase in population is if all offspring survive, there would be astronomical numbers of individuals which could not handle all those, wouldn't be enough resources to handle those. Individual variations is there is variation in offspring. For natural selection, the variation must be gene expressed and be capable to be inherited. So that's what drives those mutations or individual variations of genes need to be expressed. So that way they can be used and when that environment changes. And also limiting resources. Earth has a finite number of resources, so all of those things kind of go into help playing a role of natural selection. All right, let's keep going with evolution. There are a couple different types of evolution. That's a change generally that takes place over a very long period of time, and we also supported by fossil record evidence of this. And the concept of a common ancestor states that similarities among species can be traced back to what we call a phylogenetic tree, which is what this is about this in biology. And then you can see where those organisms actually came from as far as a common ancestor. Well, evolution does stimulate creation of new species, which we know as speciation. And speciation results when segments of a population in one species become so isolated that the gene flow stops, and adaptive radiation describes as rapid speciation to fill the ecological niches is driven by either mutation or natural selection. And a little bit more on adaptive radiation is usually, there's three types. There's general. And the general ones, species develop in a radically new ability to reach new parts of its environment, for example, bird flight, allowing them to get from point A to point B. Then there's environmental change. Due to large changes in the environment, species branch into new species to occupy new niches. An example of rapid spread and development of mammalian species after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So there's obviously, no more dinosaurs, mammals took over and flourished. And then geographic isolation is isolated ecosystems are colonized by species that undergo rapid divergent evolution. In this case, an example would be Darwin's finches that you guys learn about in biology. So that's speciation. Those are some things that have helped with adaptive radiations as well. Okay? Convergent evolution is where two species, literally not close related, come towards each other as far as evolution. independently acquiring similar, what we call analogous characteristics while evolving in separate, almost sometimes varying ecosystems. For instance, development of wings in birds, insects, and bats, even though they are organisms that fly, they're not closely related. Evolutionary relay is where occurs when independent species acquire similar characteristics through their evolution in similar ecosystems, but not at the same time. An example of this would be a dorsal fin in both sharks and prehistoric dinosaurs or marine reptiles, but obviously they didn't occur at the same time. They were worlds apart. Well, I should say eons apart. Parallel evolution occurs when two independent species evolve together at the same time and in the same in the same ecosystem and acquire similar characteristics. A classic example of this is marsupials and also placental mammals, obviously thriving in the same ecosystem, and that's an example of parallel evolution, where they both have kind of gone their separate ways, but have found their way. Gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is the view of evolution that's that evolution occurs very slowly, stepwise development of species over a long period of time, millions of years, whereas punctuated equilibrium proposes that some species arose suddenly in very short periods of time, only maybe thousands of years, after long periods of stability. And those bursts of rapid evolution have led to triggered by changes of the environments. Okay, so perhaps drought or volcanic activity, things like that. Ecosystem services. There's a bunch of them that ecosystem comes through. And like moderate weather extremes and their impacts, dispersion of seeds, mitigate droughts and floods, cycle and movement of nutrients, detoxifying waste, controlling pests, maintaining biodiversity, purifying the air and water. Tons of ecosystem services are provided just depending on the different ecosystem that you're in. Now, all this information, this is all in the 3rd edition. It was left out of the 5th edition. I'm going to leave it up here for a minute. I'm not going to specifically go over all this, but this is just natural ecosystem changes that occur, where some of these changes could occur. I'm just going to highlight. I'm not going to go over each individual one. Climate shifts, obviously with global warming. Albedo is the reflectivity of a substance. So whereas land has have a moderate albedo, ocean has a low albedo, snow and ice have the highest albedo because of the reflectivity of it. The carbon cycle, change in the carbon cycle, which kind of would go with climate shifts. A greenhouse effect, which those kind of 3 things tie together, carbon cycle, greenhouse effect, and climate shifts could change the atmosphere and the temperature. Land mass distribution, so going back to plate tectonics and where those land masses ended up over 600, 800 million years ago. Plate tectonics and volcanoes, again, going hand in hand. Precession, the wobble of the Earth on its axis. As it spins around, it kind of wobbles like a top as it gets further away from the sun. As it gets closer, it kind of speeds up a little bit. The change in the orientation of the Earth in space also might have an effect on climate, and that could also cause change in the ecosystem. How much solar output? Obviously, we have no control over that, but how much energy does the sun put out obviously shapes our climates. And then there have been major climatic periods, and again, this part has been left out by the book, by the 5th edition book as well, showing you the different ice ages, the Pleistocene ice age, the different climatic periods, and those changes from ice age to non-ice age, all the way back to 2 million BC, all the way up to the present. So I'm not going to go over all these, but because they left them out, guessing you probably wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on this, but if you'd like to look it over, you're more than welcome to. And we're going to go back over some of this stuff when we look at ozone depletion, global warming, later in chapter, I believe, 11. Species movements, this is what it does pick up with. So looking at species movements, many different types of organisms inhabit Earth and have ability to move. Movement can be accomplished either passively or actively. Examples of active would include walking, running, flying, swimming. Passive would be like letting currents or winds take you from point A to point B. One common factor of why organisms move is to get to new habitats to reduce interest-specific and interest-specific competition. And then geographic distributions of plant animals are never fixed over a time period. Geographic ranges of organisms shift and change all the time. And sometimes, unfortunately, due to humans as well. Colonization and establishment takes place when populations expand in new areas, and a number of processes can initiate this process, including the disturbance of abiotic environmental changes caused by us. And plants have adapted a number of different mechanisms for dispersing their offspring. Use of specialized structures to aid an individual by wind, so like the propellers, not propellers, I guess, the helicopter seeds on the maple tree. The employment of particular structures to transport individuals by movement of water. For instance, the coconut, it floats, so therefore it can be transported water further away, doesn't sink to the bottom and go down to the bottom depths. Number 3, the production of fruit encased seeds that other organisms consume and disperse, like an apple would be eaten by a deer, and then as it defecates, it moves the seeds from point A to point B. Number 4, adhesion mechanisms, like those little burrs that you find stuck to your shoelaces. Those are actually seeds that have obviously stuck to an organism's hair, or for instance your shoelace, and then you move it, you wipe them off, and now they're found in a new spot. Or the physical injections of seeds into the ground, literally by dropping super hard and allowing them to hit a certain spot and get down in the soil to germinate. Once dispersed, an individual can colonize a new site only if it's devoid of other organisms and has those necessary requirements to grow and thrive. Our last topic today is ecological succession, which is a gradual and orderly process of ecosystem developing brought by changes in the community composition or changes in the environment. And it describes the changes in an ecosystem through time and disturbance, and rates of succession are affected by these few factors. Facilitation, when one species modifies an environment to the extent that it meets the needs of other organisms. Or inhibition is when one species modifies the environment to the extent that it's not suitable for other species. Or then tolerance, when species are affected by the presence of other species. Those 3 things shape how fast or slow ecological succession takes place. There are earlier successional species are frequently called pioneer species, and our best example of this are lichens, which are basically a cross between, I believe, moss and fungus, bacteria. I'm not exactly sure which one, but they are very unique species that require, they actually get their moisture and nutrients through the air that they absorb. And so that's our best example of a pioneer species. Later successional species include larger perennial plants, animals with greater biomass, and longer generation times. That would be kind of at the furthest part, the climax part of the ecological succession. So there are types of succession. There's allogenic, which is changes in the environment conditions create conditions beneficial to new plant communities. Primary succession, the colonization that established of a pioneer species like lichens or on bare rock. Progressive, which are communities that become more complex over time by having higher species diversity and greater biomass. Retrogressive, the environment deteriorates and results in less biodiversity or works kind of backwards against the positive feedback loop of succession. And also secondary, it begins in an area where the natural community has already been disturbed, like forest fires or clearing of a field for farming, things like that. And so this is the stages of succession of a temperate deciduous, going from annual plants all the way through that progressiveness all the way to the climax community of the hardwood trees. And the following table lists the characteristics of succession within plant communities. The characteristics, and then kind of looking at early successional stages and late successional stages. I don't feel like going through all of these, but this is a nice little characteristics, I guess, graph or diagram that shows what are the characteristics, and then are they present in early successional stages or not, or are they present in late successional stages or not. So that brings us to the end of our first chapter on ecosystems, chapter 4. I highly recommend that you guys take a look at this quick review checklist and see if you can maybe talk to your dog or your little brothers, sisters, the wall, and teach them a little bit about these definitions and also these vocabulary words before you go ahead and embark on the multiple choice section, which is, I think, 20 questions. And also do a quick review over all this stuff as well and that vocabulary. And then go ahead and take a look at the multiple choice questions. And there's also a free response question that you can take a look at on the Africanized honeybee and see if you can kind of take a look at it and then go back through and look at the right answers and also the right answers to the free response and see how you did. We'll see you guys next time for Chapter 5, where we'll be looking at biogeochemical cycles. See you next time.